Good morning, everyone. We're going to read chapter 9 of I Thought It Was Just Me, but It Isn't. So sit back, relax. It's not as long as the other ones, but it has its length to it. So practicing connection in a culture of disconnection. I sometimes explain my shame research as a study on the power of connection and the dangers of disconnection. Disconnection is both the source and consequences of shame, fear, and blame. Insulating, judging others, blaming, raging, stereotyping, labeling, these are all forms of disconnection. But there's another form of disconnection, one that is often more painful and confusing than all of these other forms. It is the feeling of being disconnected from ourselves. We are often so influenced by what other people think and so overwhelmed with trying to be who other people need us to be that we actually lose touch with our sense of self. We lose our grounding. We lose our authenticity. The reason this is so painful is because our authenticity is the very foundation from which all meaningful change occurs. In this chapter, we'll examine the concept of authenticity and why we must be authentic if we want to practice courage, compassion, and connection. We'll also explore how shame, resilience relates to addictions, speaking out, spirituality, and our need to feel quote unquote normal. Authenticity. What is authenticity? We may not know how to define it, but we certainly know when we see it. In fact, when we are in the presence of an authentic person, many of us can even feel it in our bones. We gravitate towards people who we perceived as honest, real, and sincere. We love women who radiate warmth and that down-to-earth feeling. We gather around the people who we can tell it like it is and laugh at themselves in the process. Authenticity is something we revere in others and strive to maintain in our own lives. We don't feel good about half truth, disingenuine connection, and fearful silence. We all want to have a clear sense of who we are and what we believe and to feel confident enough to share that with others. I've always liked the saying, we want to feel comfortable in our own skin. Shame often prevents us from presenting our real selves to the people around us. It sabotages our efforts to be authentic. How can we be genuine when we are desperately trying to manage and control how others perceive us? How can we be honest with people about our beliefs and at the same time tell them what we think they want to hear? How do we stand up for what we believe in when we are trying to make everyone around us feel comfortable so they won't get angry and put us down? Social work educator Dean H. Hepworth, Ronald H. Roney, and Jane Lawson define authenticity as sharing of self by relating in a natural, sincere, spontaneous, open, and genuine manner. We cannot share ourselves with others when we see ourselves as flawed and unworthy of connection. It's impossible to be real when we are ashamed of who we are and what we believe. Hold on one second. Much better. Thank you for your patience. Shame begets shame. When we sacrifice authenticity in an effort to manage how we are being perceived by others, we often get caught in a dangerous and debilitating cycle. Shame, or the fear of being shamed, moves us away from our authentic self. We tell people what they want to hear, or we don't speak out when we should. In turn, we feel shame for being dishonest, misrepresenting our beliefs, or not taking an important stand. You could see this cycle in these quotes. I sometimes say whatever people need me to say. If I'm with my liberal friends, I act liberal. If I'm with my conservative friends, I act conservative. I guess I'm so afraid that I'll say something that upsets someone that I just go with the flow. It makes me feel shallow and dishonest. My faith is a very important part of my life. I want to feel free to talk about my spiritual beliefs, just like people talk about their politics or their social beliefs. But I can't. Even if I even mention the word church, people get offended. They look at me like I'm crazy and I'm trying to convert them. I used to have a voicemail message at work that says, "Thanks for calling. Have a blessed day." My boss made me erase it because it was offensive. The people in my office use the F word all day, but they try to make me feel like I'm an outcast because I say blessed. As a Japanese American woman, I constantly hear people making sweeping assumptions about Asian women. Some of the some of them portray us as perfect minorities, smart, hardworking, and overachieving. Some of the stereotypes are sexual in nature. Asian women are often portrayed as being both permissive and submissive. All of these assumptions and stereotypes diminish our humanity. I often want to say something, but I feel too much shame. It's partly because of my cultural and partly because I'm a woman. I'd like to speak out more often, but it's very difficult and makes me feel very vulnerable. I work with a group of men and women who are absolute bigots. They always say demeaning stuff about minorities. They tell horrible jokes and send around racist emails. I'd report it to human resource manager, but he's the worst of the bunch. One day I was in the break room and a small group of these people told a horrible joke about the gay man, Matthew Shepard, who was beaten to death in Lamar, Wyoming. I didn't laugh, but I didn't say anything either. I just looked down. I felt horrible. When I watched the Lamar Project on television, I cried the entire time. I kept thinking, why didn't I say something? Why didn't I tell them how hurtful they were being? I was really ashamed of myself. I watch the news and read the newspaper. I'm very interested in politics and what's going on in the world. I try to think through my opinions and my positions before I talk about them, but inadvertently I screw up. I get nervous when someone disagrees with me or challenges my facts. Sometimes I react by shutting down, and sometimes if I really feel backed into a corner, I get louder and more emotional. Either way, I look stupid. I hate it. Why do I have to practice? Why can't I just say what's on my mind? Over the past 2 years, I've become trilingual. When I'm when I'm at work, I use white language. When I'm at home, I speak naturally, like we did growing up. I recently met new friends at church, and they shunned me at first because my natural speech was not black enough. I quickly started speaking a third language so they wouldn't think I was trying to act white. It is one thing to not feel real in the white world, but it feels far more dishonest to change who you are to feel accepted by members of your own community. Below is a list of the messages and expectations that women describe in relation to speaking out. If we look at the characteristic of authenticity, natural, sincere, spontaneous, open, and genuine, we can start to see how difficult authenticity can be if you're trying to filter our actions and thought through these narrow expectations. Don't make people feel uncomfortable, but be honest. Don't sound self righteous, but sound confident. Don't upset anyone or hurt anyone's feelings, but say what's on your mind. Don't be offensive, but be straightforward. Sound informed and educated, but not like a know it all. Sound committed, but not too reactionary. Don't say anything unpopular or controversial, but have the courage to disagree with the crowd. Don't seem too passive, but don't come off as too dispassionate. Don't get too emotional, but don't be too detached. You don't have to quote facts and figures, but don't be wrong. Jeez. So, you should speak out, but if you do, make sure it's nice and positive. On the face of it, they seem ridiculous. They are completely contradictory and totally subjective. But Who gets to define offensive or emotional? What is too passionate and what is too dispassionate? These rules are built around rigid gender rules that leave women with very little room to navigate expectations while maintaining authenticity. If we break one of these rules, we are automatically labeled and stereotyped. If we assert ourselves, we become the pushy, loudmouth bitch who everyone loves to hate. If we clarify or correct, we become the arrogant know it all who no one can stand to be around. If we're honest about something that is taboo or makes other people feel uncomfortable, we're labeled as a weirdo or a freak, or the person that is not um, positive. If two women get into a heated political debate on television, it's a cat fight. Whereas if two men get into the same debate, it's a lively discussion on important issues. When we start to examine the messages and expectations that fuel our unwanted identities, it's easy to understand how shame can undermine our authenticity. We simply can't speak our truth when we are held hostage by what other people think. In this next section, we'll take a look at the concept of normalcy. Sometimes our need to feel normal or be perceived as normal overrides our commitment to authenticity. This is especially true around the shame trigger that leaves us feeling alone and like an outsider. Hold on 1 second, please. Shame and normalcy. Shame makes me feel like we are different, like we are the only ones. During the interview process, I can't tell you how many times I heard women say, I just want to feel normal. Don't know what normal feels. As women, we are absolutely bombarded with the media driven messages about normalcy, especially about sex and physical and mental wellness. A great example of this is a recent Glamour magazine cover that read, "Are you normal about sex? Intimate details on what everyone is doing." To overcome these feelings of shame about being strange and abnormal, we seek normalcy. Being real, genuine, or sincere can feel secondary to fitting in. During the interviews, I realized that sometimes the quest for normalcy comes down to numbers. How many times per week do my husband and I need to have sex to be normal? How many sexual partners am I allowed to have if I'm 25 and single? On a scale from 1 to 10, how weird is it if my husband likes to do this? How many couples try this? How many women do you know who are willing to do that? How many women my age are on this medication? What are my odds if I get off the hormones? How many women have this diagnosis? How many times have you seen a case like mine? How long will it take for my sex drive to come back? How much weight do I need to lose to avoid a lecture on my next weigh-in at the doctor's office? What is my BMI? Oh, somebody please just give me a number. When we can't get good information because it's either tainted by marketing spin or the topics are too taboo for public discussion, we become desperate for a measure of normalcy. We want to know what's normal because being normal affords us a great opportunity for acceptance and belonging. When I spoke to women about sex and health, many participants asked me how their responses compared to the responses from other participants. It was only during discussions about these topics that women asked questions like, what are other women saying? Or does this fit in with what you're hearing from other people? What makes this media-driven expectation so dangerous is their ability to exploit our need to feel normal by showing us images of reality and labeling them abnormal. Think about all these ads that say, if you are feeling tired and overwhelmed, or if you aren't having sex this much, or if you are too anxious about the safety of your children, or if your skin looks like this. Clearly, some interventions and medications are very useful and appropriate. Many advertisements, however, prey on the vulnerability of women by exploiting our need to feel normal. I think they prey on the vulnerability of everyone trying to feel normal. They also exploit our very human need for acceptance and belonging by showing images of so-called undersexed or unhealthy people alone and sad. Of course, the final shots of the commercial show the once distraught person having tried their pill or used their lotion surrounded by friends and family in a full of slow motion laughter. The money and marketing behind these advertisements results in more than the overprescribed and overuse of medicines and remedies. In a market driven medical environment that values um, profit, expediency, and profit, many women who could benefit from drug therapy are denied services because they lack the resources to cover medical expenses. Additionally, as a result of the U.S. insurance companies stripping mental health coverage from most plans, women who could benefit from a combination of medication and counseling, which research shows is far more effective than medication alone, can only access medication. And mind body practices aren't covered by any insurance companies. And there's so much research to support the fact that those actually work. I'm sorry. I remember carefully watching the pharmaceutical television ads that aired the week after the events of 9/11. About 3 or 4 days after the attack, an entire advertising campaign was launched that targeted women who worried too much about their children. The ads used lines like, "You used to be more fun," or "You used to smile more." One minute I got really angry and think, how sinister. There's not a mother in the country who's not worried about her kids right now. The next minute I think, okay, I need these pills. I'm obsessed about safety. I think this is exactly what I need. After about a week, I was afraid I was going crazy simply because I continually felt crazed about this situation. I finally called a friend who has young children and is a family therapist. Here's what I'm doing and here's what I'm thinking. Am I normal? Yes, very. You're normal, and the other 100 women who have called me are normal. If you're so worried about Ellen that you aren't functioning, we should talk more about it. If you're mostly worried because you think you're crazy, because you're so worried, you're normal. Worrying about our children, our safety is a very appropriate reaction right now. These are scary times. This sentimental this sentiment illustrates a pattern of vulnerability that I've heard over and over during the conversations about health and sex. Here is how I summarize that pattern. I can't get to my real feelings about sex, my body, my physical health, or my mental and emotional health because there are too many messages and expectations blocking my way. I'm so worried about what, who, and how I'm supposed to be that I can't figure out who I am and who I want to be. If I try to talk about it, I feel shut down because very few people are willing to have honest conversations about sex and health. Eventually, I give up on being authentic and just hope to be perceived as normal. The deluge of messages and expectations combined with the stigma of talking about sex and health can leave women feeling overwhelmed with shame. When we feel like this, we are more likely to reinforce the messages and expectations, individualize the problems, and feel like our inability to meet the expectations is about our own deficits or pathology. When the code of silence prevents us from reaching out to others we feel alone, we feed shame with secrecy and silence and end up grasping for our shame screens. My husband likes to have sex all the time. I do it because I don't want him to cheat or do something with someone else or do it with someone else. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only person that feels like that, if there's something wrong with me, or if other people have husbands that are like that too. The part that's so hard is you really can't talk to anyone about it. So I don't know why. I don't know what you really do. Next thing. When I was in my 20s, I loved sex, or at least I think I liked it. I like sex. Either way, I slept around a lot. Now that I'm married and I have children, it's like a constant battle between me and my husband. I will do anything to avoid having sex. I will fake being sick. I'll pick a fight. I'll do anything. What I really want to do is just go into the bedroom, shut my door, and be by myself. The last thing I want to do is have sex. My husband says there's something wrong with me. Sometimes I think he's right, and sometimes when I hear other people talking about it, I think I'm okay. Next thing. When I think about sex and shame, the first thing I think about are blowjobs. I don't think there's anything more shameful than that. It's degrading. Of course, now it's become popular. Now, if you say no, you feel like you're the only person not doing it, and your boyfriend is like the only one in the universe with a girlfriend who doesn't like it. Sometimes I do it because I feel like I'm supposed to. One time I almost started crying. Next thing. No one knows I've been diagnosed with clinical depression, not even my partner. She thinks I've been acting weird because I'm going through menopause. Once you tell somebody you're having mental health problems, they blame everything on you being crazy. You automatically become untrustworthy and unstable. I don't want people to think I'm weak or I can't handle life. I don't know if anybody can handle life right now. I just can't do things like pap smears and mammograms. I could never get a colonoscopy. I know it's horrible and I know that I need to, but I just can't do it. I always worry about what the nurse will think or what the doctor will think. What if I do something gross or what if they think I'm disgusting? I just can't bring myself to do it. My children ask me if I've gone and I lie and tell them yes. This makes me feel even worse. Next thing. Sex is the most difficult issue in my marriage. We both know it's a problem, but it's the one issue we can't seem to talk about. It's helpful to know that other couples struggle too, but it doesn't really make it better. I've almost given up on having a good sex life. Sometimes I just wish we could have sex enough so it didn't feel like the pink elephant in the room. I'm so uptight about it, I've lost touch with my physical and emotional feelings. When we feel all of the painful and overwhelming feelings associated with shame, we are also not very good at assessing where we are and what we want. It presents a very difficult situation for women. How do I get out of shame about sex and health long enough to develop resiliency to shame about sex and health? To answer this question, let's look at some of the strategies employed by women who have high levels of shame resilience around sex and health. Resilience and normalcy. The women who have developed shame resilience around sex and health issue work on 4 elements, but they are particularly aware of the vulnerabilities created by the secrecy and silence that shroud these issues. Through a variety of strategies that directly relate to each of the 4 continuum, these women have managed to hear their own voices over the competing and conflicting messages and expectations around them. They've managed to build enough empathy to think clearly, evaluate their own needs, and determine what makes them feel connected, powerful, and free. When I first started talking to women about sex and health, I thought the difference between wanting to be normal and not knowing or caring about normal was about confidence level rather than shame resilience. However, the more I talk to women, the more I realize that the participants with high levels of shame resilience and are not inherently more confident. Rather, they are committed to work on each of the 4 continuums in order to build resilience. Here's how I summarize the pattern that emerged across the interviews. In order to get to my real feelings about sex, my body, my physical health, or my mental and emotional health, I have to acknowledge and filter all of the messages and expectations that block my way. When I'm so worried about what I'm supposed to be, who I'm supposed to be, and how I'm supposed to be, I can't figure out who I am and who I want to be. I must understand where these messages come from so I can address them and move on. I need to talk about it and because so few people are willing to have honest conversations about sex and health, I have to build connections with people who I can reach out to. I need to talk about my feelings and my needs too. my needs so I don't cut myself off from the important parts of my life. I don't know what's normal. I just want to be my authentic self. If you pull this pattern apart, you could see how the pieces fit with the continuums. 1, recognizing shame triggers. When I'm so worried about what I'm supposed to be, who I am supposed to be, and how I'm supposed to be, I can't figure out who I am and who I want to be. I must understand where these messages come from so I can address them and move on. Practicing critical awareness. In order to get to my real feelings about sex, my body, my physical health, or my mental and emotional health, I have to acknowledge and filter all the messages and expectations that block my way. Reaching out. I need to talk about it, and because so few people are willing to have honest conversations about sex and health, I have to build connections with people who I can reach out to. Speaking shame. I need to talk about my feelings and my needs so I don't cut myself off from these important parts of my life. I don't know what's normal. I just want to be my authentic self. Next, we'll look at the complex relationship between addiction and shame. One way we ease the pain and discomfort of feeling inauthentic and different is substance use. We use food, alcohol, drugs, sex, relationships as relief. In this next section, we're going to take a closer look at the complex relationship between shame and addiction. Addictions due to shame what salt water does to thirst. Terrence Real, author of I Don't Want to Talk About It, Overcoming the Secret Legacy of Male Depression. As you read through this book, you could see from the examples and stories that addiction and shame are excruciatingly, I can't even talk, connected. You know what they're saying. They're connected, that addiction and shame are connected. They are also very similar. Both leave us feeling disconnected and powerless. When we are in addiction, we have a tendency to either shut down or act out. Addiction can make us feel alone and on the outside. And lastly, there is often a sense of secrecy and silence about addiction. Although many people think of addiction as a guy's issue, really? That couldn't be further from the facts. Many of the most recent alcohol and drug studies show that teenage girls are drinking more than boys and starting at an earlier age than the male peers. New research also shows that more college-age women are drinking and drinking to get drunk. Researchers are finding that women often use alcohol to improve their mood, increase their confidence, reduce tension, and feel less shy. Dr. Nora Volkoy, director of the National Institution on Drug Abuse, calls alcohol a social lubricant. When I look back at my own history, the social lubricant idea certainly fits. Like many girls, I started drinking socially in high school. By college, I considered a cigarette and a beer my social sword and shield. I'm not sure that I could have navigated a party or a bar without this armor. I never thought about my social dependency on drinking and smoking. Everyone I knew did it, and everywhere I looked, the people I wanted to be did it. It was the 1980s. We were rebellious like the women in the Virginia Slims ads, and we flocked to movies like St. Elmo's Fire and About Last Night. It wasn't until I was in graduate school that I really learned about my family history of alcoholism. We never had much alcohol in our house, and I didn't grow up around a lot of drinking. As I made my way through the personal war that most social work students do in conjunction with their studies, I learned that alcohol had ravaged the lives of many of my extended family members. I also started to get a clearer understanding of my own social dependency on alcohol. I quit drinking and smoking in 1996, the weekend I graduated with my master's degree in social work. I was lucky. I had the information and tools to make that choice and found the support I needed to put down the sword and shield. I consider my journey in recovery to be one of the greatest gifts in my life. For many girls and women, their bottoms are much lower. They lose their partners, jobs, freedom, or children. For many women, problematic alcohol use is connected to sexual assault, violence, and/or dependency on other drugs. In a recent Newsweek article, studies are cited that show that young women who chronologically abuse alcohol can get serious liver disease and ulcer, and that all women who drink more than one drink a day are at higher risk for stroke, high blood pressure, suicide, and breast cancer. To better understand the role that shame plays in addiction, or perhaps the role addiction plays in shame, we need to understand how the two are connected. I intuitively knew there was a connection, but didn't really understand it. Shame and addiction feel so enmeshed in many ways that it's difficult to understand where one starts and the other ends. To get a better sense of how shame and addiction work together, I turned to the latest research examining their relationship. In chapter 2, I recommended the book Shame and Guilt by June Tangini and Rona Deering. In addition to their broader work on the topic, they also wrote an important article that recently appeared in the journal Addictive Behaviors. Rona Deering, who led the study, is a researcher at the Research Institute on Addiction, University of Buffalo, State University of New York. Rather than trying to translate their findings from their studies, I thought it might be helpful for you to hear firsthand from the researcher. In an interview conducted specifically for this book, I asked Dr. Deering to help us better understand the importance of her findings and how they might affect us. Here's what she had to say. Brene Brown. I've read the book that you wrote with June Tangini, and I think we agree that shame and guilt are two distinct emotions. Shame equals I am bad, and guilt equals I did something bad. What exactly do the terms shame proneness, and guilt proneness mean? RD must be Rona Deering. When we refer to shame proneness and guilt proneness, we are referring to any given individual's tendency to experience that emotion. In any given situation, some individuals are more likely to respond with an emotional reaction of shame, whereas others are less likely to experience shame, regardless of the situational triggers. We would refer to the individual who is likely to respond with shame as a shame-prone individual. To use a different example, some people may be prone to crying when they are feeling sad, whereas other individuals may feel sad equally often, but they are rather unlikely to cry in response to their sadness. We might refer to the tendency to cry as crying proneness. Most individuals have a pretty good idea of whether they are prone to crying or not. Using measures such as the TOSCA, a research instrument, we present individuals with a variety of everyday situations and ask them to indicate their likelihood of responding in a variety of ways, some representing shame responses, others representing guilt responses. Using their responses, we can determine each person's tendency towards shame proneness and guilt proneness. Although it is possible to be both shame and guilt prone, shame prone and guilt prone, it is more likely that a specific individual will respond with one emotion more than the other. Thus, any given individual is more likely to be either shame prone or guilt prone rather than both. BB, in your article, you talk about the factors that lead to addiction. Specifically, you discuss the importance of understanding the differences between the static and dynamic factors associated with substance abuse. Can you help us understand what these terms mean? RD. When I mention static factors, I am referring to things that really can't be changed. So, for example, although we know that genetic factors are related to one's likelihood of developing an addiction, a person really can't change the genes they were born with. Dynamic factors are, on the other hand, are things that are constantly changing or have the potential to change. Something like one's social network would be considered a dynamic factor. People have choices about who they socialize with, and any given individual can either choose to socialize with people who use drugs or people who don't, or as just one example. We believe that shame proneness and guilt proneness are dynamic. They have the potential to be changed. Ideally, in a therapy setting, we'd like to help clients learn to become less shame prone and more guilt prone. BB. In this study, you found a positive link between shame prone and problematic alcohol and drug use. What do you think is most important about this finding? What does it mean for people struggling with addiction? RD. Well, first of all, I think that this finding is consistent with most of the other research on shame proneness. Namely, the tendency to experience shame seems to be associated with negative life consequences. Whether these consequences are Namely, the tendency to experience shame seems to be associated with negative life consequences. Whether these consequences are difficult, managed anger, depressive symptoms, addictive problems, or anything else. So I think the most important thing about this finding is that it provides additional evidence that individuals who have a tendency to experience shame need to learn to derail this emotion in favor of the healthier emotional reaction, guilt. I think that many therapists try to help clients develop this skill, whether or not these therapies would specifically label their work as shame reduction. However, there has been very little systematic research looking at ways to teach clients to reduce their tendency towards shame. Specific interventions of this type are much needed. We need to test and validate these types of interventions using sound research methods in order to provide therapists with specific tools to help their clients reduce shame. BB. You also found that guilt proneness may actually have a protective effect against the development of problematic alcoholism or substance abuse patterns. Can you help us understand what that means? RD. People who are guilt prone are likely to focus on the behavior in question. For example, a guilt prone person who misses a day of work after a night of heavy drinking is likely to think, if I keep missing work, I could lose my job. In contrast, a person who is shame prone is much more likely to focus on what they view as a defective self. I'm a complete failure because I keep missing work. As you can imagine, it's much easier to change or fix any given behavior than it is to fix a defective self. So as a result, the guilt-prone person in this situation who will try to figure out what they can do differently. For instance, they may strategize about how it would be better not to drink on nights when they have to work the next day, or how it would be better not to drink to the point where they can't function effectively the next day. The shame-prone person, because he is overwhelmed by the emotion resulting from the realization that he is bad, defective, unworthy, can't problem solve, and therefore can't make the same type of plans for how to do things differently and hopefully better the next time he finds himself in a similar situation. In essence, the shame-prone person gets stuck in the emotion, whereas the guilt-prone person is able to move on. BB. I'm often asked if shame leads to addiction or if addiction leads to shame. What are your thoughts about this question? I don't think it is one or the other. I think it's both. I think that if a person has a shame prone emotional style, he or she is at risk for developing an addiction. However, I think that once a person begins to struggle with issues related to their addiction, shame is an inevitable consequence. So, for example, consider a person who has an addiction to alcohol. If that person is already shame prone, his or her life problems that result from alcohol use, problems at work, problems at home, problems in relationships, etc., are likely to cause him or her to evaluate these shortcomings and react with feelings and shames in the accompanying interpretations that I must be a bad person. So I think of the link between, wait. Yeah. In the accompanying interpretation that I must be a bad person. So I think of the link between shame and addiction as a vicious cycle and one that is difficult to change. That's hopeful. Resilience and addiction. There are several issues that strike me as very important about this interview. The first is the cyclical relationship between shame and addiction. In this chapter on speaking shame, we talked about the 3 strategies of disconnection: moving away, moving towards, and moving against. After years of using these strategies to fight shame, it is not easy to abandon them even when we know at some level that they are not effective. Many of us use these strategies to deal with unmet needs for empathy. Getting stuck in these disconnections not only moves us away from authenticity, but the stuck part also seems to play a central role in the relationship between shame and addiction. The second issue Dr. Deering referenced to therapists helping clients is one that feels critically important to me. Throughout this book, as I've talked about the various ways that we build shame resilience, I've tried to emphasize, and I think it's worth repeating here, that due to complexities of shame, building resilience may require professional help from a therapist or counselor. If we are struggling with addiction, our family and friends are often negatively affected and truly incapable of helping. Dr. Abby Williams, director of the Center for Recovering Families, a division of the Council on Alcohol and Drugs in Houston, writes, "We estimate that 3 to 4 family members are directly affected to some degree when one of the members is making poor choices. These affected family members oftentimes believe that it is up to them to help their family run smoothly. In truth, this belief makes matters even worse. The resulting behavior in that family can be as destructive as the original problem that family was attempting to correct." In this section on addiction, I want to clearly state that I believe we must seek outside help to overcome addiction. Help might come from a therapist, a recovery center, or a 12-step group, but we need to find outside help. Recovering from addiction requires guidance, support, and information, and sometimes medical attention beyond what we can get from even the most supportive connection networks. Last, in Dr. Deering's example, she says people have choices about who they socialize with, and any given individual can either choose to socialize with people who use drugs or people who don't. This is true. But one influence we need to examine in addition to our social networks is our culture. We are members of a culture that fosters then vilifies addiction. Psychologist and activist Charlotte Sophia Gossel writes, patriotic hierarchy in capitalism, or create, encourage, maintain, and perpetrate addiction and dependency. As we've discussed throughout this book, the shame web is baited with expectations that are based on rigid gender prescriptions. If you combine the power of these expectations with the us and them mentality discussed in the chapters on otherness and the influence of the media culture, I believe she is right. We turn to food, drugs, alcohol, sex, and dependent relationships to temporarily relieve the stress. And as expressed in the opening quote in this section, addiction doesn't relieve the stress. It only makes us desperate for relief. Additionally, we live in a shame culture when it comes to addiction. On the other hand, we use negative stereotypes to categorize those struggling with addiction as smarmy, slippery, lying, cheating, untrustworthy, and manipulative. On the other hand, we often use positive stereotypes to unrealistically describe men and women in recovery as pillars of spiritual strength who lead fearless and rigorously examined lives. In supporting these cultural stereotypes, we often fail to acknowledge that all of us are in some way struggling or connected to someone who is struggling with addiction. And if we honestly reflect on our own lives, we know that stereotyping never captures the diversity, complexity, and depths of real experiences. Okay, let's see. How much longer? Oh, I thought it was almost over. Spirituality. The relationship between spirituality or faith and shame is a complex one. As you see in the illustrations of the shame web in the connection network, spirituality, faith, religion are sources of shame for some women and sources of resilience for others. I'm often asked if one religion was identified as more shaming than others. The answer is no. I saw no evidence of one religion or one religion being more shaming than another. I did see important patterns and themes in terms of how women experience their faith and spirituality. For example, the women who talked about feeling shame used the words church and religion more. The women who talked about resilience used the terms faith, spirituality, and beliefs more. At first, I wondered if there was a connection between organized religion and shame. I didn't find one. At least half of the women who used the terms faith, spirituality, and beliefs attended church and were members of an organized religion. What did become clear to me is this. It is the relationship that women have with God, their higher power, or their spiritual world that often serves as a source of resilience. The essence of resilience in a spiritual sense is about relationships, spirit, and faith. For many women, spiritual connection is essential to shame resilience. In fact, over half of the women who, as children, experienced deep shame around religion developed shame resilience by forging new spiritual paths. They may have changed churches or their beliefs, but spirituality and faith remain an important part of their lives. Another pattern that emerged is the belief that faith is about nurturing our best selves, and shame moves us away from that purpose. The sources of shame seem much more connected to the earthly, man-made, and interpreted rules and regulations, and the social community expectations around religion. Do you go to church regularly? Are you loyal to the family religion? Are you raising your kids a certain way? Are you breaking rules that might shame the family or community? Do you know your place as a woman? Just like in many other institutions, i.e., corporations, schools, medicines, government, individuals and groups in leadership positions can use shame as an instrument of control. When this happens in a repeated and systematic way, the entire organizational culture becomes shame-based. I don't believe, however, that any institution is inherently shaming, including those institutions that make up our faith community. For those of us who seek spiritual connection, understanding our faith history in relation to shame is very important. Many of the women who experience religious-based shame as children found the greatest healing through faith and spirituality. Although they often changed church, denominations, and sometimes even belief, they healed shame-based religious wounds with spirituality. My personal spiritual path has been changed by my work as a shame researcher. I now try to see my healthy expression of guilt as spiritual checks and balance systems. When I do things or think things are inconsistent with who I want to be, I work on experiencing guilt as an opportunity for my spiritual growth. On the other hand, when I experience shame, I now believe that it moves me away from the spiritual growth that is so important to me. There is a beautiful quote from spiritual teacher Marianne Williamson that really inspires me. As you read, I invite you to think about what she has written in the context of experiencing shame. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightening about shrinking so that other people won't feel unsure around you. We were born to be magnificent, the glory of God that's within us. It's not just in some of us, it is in everyone. As we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we're liberated from our own fear, our own presence automatically liberates others. Given how important relationships are in our faith life, you can see why it's so critical that we maintain our authenticity around our spiritual belief. In this next section, you will learn specific tools women are using to develop and maintain their authenticity in the face of shame and disconnection. Authenticity and resilience. We know from the beginning of this chapter that some of the qualities of authenticity include being natural, sincere, spontaneous, open, and genuine. But what does authenticity look like in a person? When I think of authenticity, I think of Shaz, a very close friend of mine. I've known him for more than 10 years, and he's one of the most authentic people I know. He's the real deal. Shaz certainly demonstrates all the characteristics listed above, but I see his authenticity as something more. He is who he is, no matter who he's with and no matter what the circumstance. If you pulled people from all different parts of his life, people who don't know each other, but people who know him, they would probably all describe him in a very similar way. He is quite comfortable moving around and among many different types of people, but he articulates and acts on the same set of values, beliefs, regardless of who he is with or what they expect. I saw this same quality in the women who clearly had high levels of shame resilience. To me, this quality of being who you are, regardless of who you are with, seems the very essence of authenticity, the result of being natural, sincere, spontaneous, open, and genuine. So how does authenticity relate to shame resilience? Based on the data, I would say the authenticity is difficult, if not impossible, to develop without some level of shame resilience. It is much easier to be authentic when we practice courage, compassion, and connection. The participants spoke about their importance of building connection with people who support our goal of authenticity. Sometimes these people are also like-minded or like-spirited, but that's not the most important requirement. It is more important that they share our commitment to being authentic rather than just sharing our beliefs or values. During a very difficult conversation with my sister, she told me that she had trouble trusting me because I always tried to predict what other people wanted and say whatever I thought they wanted to hear. She told me, I don't care if we disagree. I just want to be able to count on you for the truth. I was ashamed that she perceived me that way, but it really helped me understand how I was being dishonest with everyone, especially myself. For the first few months after our conversation, I couldn't answer anyone's questions. I totally lost track of what I really thought about issues. It'd been a year and it's been about a year and I'm much more honest with myself and my family. My sister is so supportive and I feel like I have a lot more integrity. I used to feel like I had two choices with my parents: avoid conversations about religion or lie. Both options made me feel bad and caused huge problems between me and my husband. My parents are Catholic, and they would always ask if we were going to Mass or if we're sending my son to Catholic, whatever. I would tell them yes and try to end the conversation. My husband would tell them the truth, that we were Methodists, and they would go nuts. He told me that he felt abandoned when I lied to my parents and to make them happy. I realized that I was being dishonest and hurting myself and him. I spoke with some friends from church who had similar experiences, and they gave me great suggestions. I finally told my parents and explained that if they couldn't be supportive, it would be best not to discuss it. They were mad but respectful, and that's okay. Self-empathy and the strengths perspective. One issue that is clear from the interviews is how incredibly hard we are on ourselves. More times than not, we are members of our own shame web. Even if we are only enforcing the expectations that we hear from others or from the media, we are still actively contributing to our own shame. If we want to build shame resilience and cultivate our authenticity, we must learn how to become members of our own connection network. We must learn how to respond to ourselves with empathy and understanding. It takes a lot of work to stay out of judgment about others. It takes even more work to stay out of self-judgment. Our ability to be authentic and genuine often depends on our level of self-acceptance, our sense of belonging to ourselves, and our ability to express self-empathy. One way that we can increase our self-empathy and the connection to ourselves is to explore and acknowledge our strengths as well as our problems or limitations. As social workers, many of us do this using an approach called a strengths perspective. According to social work educator Dennis Selby, the strength perspective offers us the opportunity to examine our struggles in light of our capacities, talents, competencies, possibilities, visions, values, and hopes. These perspectives don't diminish the pain and serious nature of our struggles. However, it does require us to consider our positive qualities as potential resources. Dr. Selby writes, it is as wrong to deny the possible as it is to deny the problem. One effective method for understanding our strength is to examine the relationship between strengths and limitations. If we examine what we do best and what we want to change the most, we will often find that the two behaviors are varying degrees of the same core behavior. For example, I think that about my own struggles of authenticity. Sometimes when I feel very critical of myself, I really question my authenticity. I judge myself for being too political and feeling chameleon like in my behaviors. When I'm on my work branch, I turn one color. When I'm at home, I'm another color. When I'm with one set of colleagues, I accent one hue and I turn on a completely different hue with a different set of colleagues. I can work myself into believing that I'm everything from slightly disingenuous to downright cheesy. However, looking at these same behaviors from a strength perspective, I could completely reframe my experiences. Rather than feeling inauthentic and chameleon like, I can honestly say that I'm comfortable around many different people in many different settings, and that I'm pretty comfortable discussing topics that range from economics to the latest Nick Jr. lineup on TV. I don't contradict myself, although I will avoid some subjects with some groups. I'm often overwhelmed by how many different roles I play and how quickly I'm expected to switch gears. However, I think I do it pretty well, and I would consider it a strength. I can go through almost every one of my faults or limitations and find strengths. Purpose of doing this is not to diminish the issues we'd like to change or invalidate our problems, but to allow us to work on those from a place of self-worth, empathy, and connection. I think one of the most important things I learned from this research, and one of the key messages I hope I'm sending in this book, is this: we cannot change and grow when we are in shame, and we can't use shame to change ourselves or others. I can shame myself for being too controlling and uptight about my work, or I can recognize that I'm very responsible, dependable, and committed to quality work. The issues at work don't go away, but from a strengths perspective, I have the confidence to look at myself and assess the issues I'd like to change. It is important to understand that the strengths perspective is not a tool to simply allow us to put a positive spin on a problem and consider it solved, but rather to allow us to inventory our strengths so that we can use them to address the challenges. I can shame myself for being too worried about my daughter all the time, or I can reframe that using my strengths and focus on the fact that I'm trying to be a good parent and I'm a very thoughtful, involved, and conscientious mother. From a place of self-worth, it is easier for me to think about how I might be a better mom if I reality check some of my fears and recognize that I'm doing plenty to keep her safe and happy. From a place of shame and disconnection, it would be very difficult for me to assess my behavior, much less attempt to change them. I often require my students to submit a strength assessment at the beginning of the semester. I ask them to list 10 to 15 personal strengths. Be assured I don't accept anything like I'm a people person or I play well with others. They hate doing this exercise, which is ironic considering that this is something that social workers very often expect their clients to do. Not surprisingly, when I ask them to identify their limitations or opportunities for growth, they buzz right through it and normally list far more than the 5 examples I asked for. It's human nature. We focus on our shortcomings and can you tell I'm tired of reading? We focus on our shortcomings and ignore and take our strengths for granted. It is critical that we catch ourselves doing things well. If we can acknowledge our strengths, they become tools that can help us meet our goals. For example, Natalie, a research participant, told me, I can't talk about my faith because I don't think that there is one right answer. I'm not worried about sounding stupid. I don't care if people judge me. I just care about being honest. I freeze when people talk about politics or public issues. I feel so ashamed that I don't know more or I don't have the right information. Oh, sorry. It starts off, I can talk about my faith because I don't think that there's one right answer. If Natalie wants to work on her authenticity around speaking out on politics or social issues, it would be very, very useful for her to assess her strengths that allow her to be authentic in her discussions about faith. What is she doing that makes her feel authentic? What tool is she using to be genuine in her discussion? Why is she so comfortable talking about faith and not politics? Based on my discussion with Natalie, I think it would be helpful for her to reframe her ideas about politics and social issues, having only one right answer. She might also think about changing her goal from being right, having the right information, and knowing more to being honest about her thoughts. She seems to do that very well. Lastly, we can more readily identify our strengths and increase our resilience by adapting the reality check questions to examine the expectations that attempt to govern how we articulate and act on our beliefs and values. How realistic are these expectations? Can I be all these things all of the time? Do I want to be? Can all of these characteristics exist in one authentic person? Does meeting the expectations make me more or less authentic? Am I describing my authentic self or who others want me to be? When I ask participants how they determine who belongs in their connection network and who belongs in their shame web, about 80% of the women said something along the lines, if I can always be myself with someone, they're in the connection network. I think the ability to be ourselves is both the heart of authenticity and the true benefit of building shame resilience. Shame resilience theory. The information in this book is based on the theory of shame resilience that emerged from my research. I really like the definition of theory found in the Fifth Discipline Field book, a wonderful book on building learning organizations. The author defines theory as a fundamental set of propositions about how the world works, which has been subjected to repeated tests in which we have gained some confidence. The English word theory comes from the Greek root word theories, means spectator. This derives from the same root as the word theater. Human beings invent theories from the same basic reason they invent theater, to bring out into a public space a play of ideas that might help us better understand our world. My theory on shame is called the shame resilience theory. It offers a set of propositions about how shame affects women. If we look at the continuum as distinct pieces of a larger puzzle, we could see how the theory comes together. The major propositions that explain how shame works are: number one, shame is best defined as intensely painful feelings or experiences of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. Women often experience shame when they are entangled in a web of layered, conflicting, and competing social community expectation. Shame creates fear, blame, and disconnection. Number two, the opposite of experiencing shame is experiencing empathy. Number three, empathy requires that we practice ordinary courage, compassion, and connection. Number four, we cannot become resistant to shame. However, we can develop shame resilience. Shame resilience is best conceptualized as a continuum, with shame anchoring one end and empathy anchoring the other end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Our level of shame resilience is determined by our combined ability to recognize shame in our specific triggers, our level of critical awareness, our willingness to reach out to others, and our ability to speak shame. In other words, our position on the shame resilience continuum is actually the sum of our positions on these other four continuums. Number 6, we must assess our shame resilience independently from each shame category. A high level of shame resilience in one area does not guarantee high shame resilience in other shame resilience for other areas, for all areas. Sorry. Number 7, women with high levels of shame resilience recognize shame when they are experiencing it and recognize their shame triggers. Understanding our shame allows us to better recognize shame and reach out for support. When we don't know our vulnerabilities, we rely on ineffective methods to protect ourselves from the pain caused by shame. I call these shame screens. I think this is no 6, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is 8. Women who practice critical awareness. Yeah, 8. Women who practice critical awareness have high levels of shame resilience. Critical awareness helps us demystify, contextualize, and normalize our shame experiences. A lack of critical awareness can result in our reinforcing, individualized, pathologizing our shame experiences. 9, women who reach out to others who are experiencing shame have higher levels of shame resilience. Reaching out allows us to share our stories and create change. When we don't reach out to others, we often start separating and insulating ourselves from others. 10, women who speak shame have high levels of shame resilience. Speaking shame gives us the tools we need to express how we feel and ask for what we need. When we don't speak shame, we often start to shut down or act out. And that is it. The shame resilience model. This is the back of page 9. It is the end of page 9. And I have to say, my voice is done. So I hope you enjoyed chapter 9, and I will be back at some point to read chapter 10, which is the last chapter in the book. Have an amazing day, and I will see you soon. Thank you.